And really what we did last week was just to kind of take a topic, and I'll kind of talk about a topic a little bit. I know some of you have been through the 21-day challenge and are continuing on your meditation journey. So if you have questions around that, general questions around mindfulness and meditation, you're more than welcome to shoot anything that's needed. I listened to a really nice podcast this week with Eckhart Tolle was being interviewed by Russell Brand. So Russell Brand has a really beautiful podcast. So for those of you who don't know that Russell Brand is now a reformed character, he was once a slightly crazy character, especially in the UK. Had a particular penchant for drugs and alcohol and women and all kinds of things that got Russell into lots and lots of trouble. But Russell, I think, really exemplifies and demonstrates the capacity of redemption really available to everybody. He's in AA and has been for many years. And he attracts some incredible people to come onto the podcast. And for those of you who don't know Eckhart Tolle, he's written one of probably the most well-read books in the sense of spirituality, and in a non-religious sense, in the context of spirituality more about being connected to yourself rather than being connected to a particular God. But his book is called The Power of Now, and it's quite an incredible read. And Eckhart Tolle was in Cambridge University. He was there at the time when Stephen Hawking was in the ascendancy. He was an incredibly bright teacher and professor in Cambridge at 29 years of age. And he was struggling with his own mental health very badly, came to the point of being suicidal and wanting to give up on his existence, and discovered that if he sat with himself, and he did for many, many days, and he explains this quite beautifully in the book, but he basically found a park bench in Cambridge and sat on it for days and days and days and days, and just came to terms with who he was, what was going on, and allowed the kind of noise and chaos to slowly just find its space and settle and settle and settle and settle. And as it did, he started to understand himself. Therapy in most contexts that people go to, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or whether it's other types of psychotherapy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create the space and capacity for people to slow down and reflect on their own lives. So when I work with people on a one-to-one basis, I'm never giving them advice. That's just not my role, because really the answers that everybody needs in the context of their own journey are already within themselves. You have all of what you need here. But what we tend not to do is give ourselves the space and time to actually listen and think about what's good for me. How do I feel right now? Where do I really want to go next with my life? And even when I put that slight pause in, it kind of accentuates the fact that we all don't really ask those questions of ourselves, nor do we want to think about it. We constantly are in this pursuit of, what am I going to do next? What's the next thing for me to do? So we just keep piling things on top of other things, on top of other things, on top of other things, and experiences, and hoping that the next thing is going to be the thing that makes me feel whatever it is I'm trying to feel. So Tolle, in his book, explains beautifully how he just sat on the bench and he just came to terms with himself over many days and weeks. One of the old traditions always was that the person who was struggling with their own mental health or anxiety or depression would go and sleep. And again, when you look at the clinical studies around sleep, resting for weeks is a very good path to recover in the context of one's own mental health. Now, of course, sitting on a park bench for days and weeks or sleeping for a few weeks is not really available in the modern world. People want to take the paracetamol, the Panadol, numb the pain, have a few drinks, keep going, push forward, push forward, push forward. If we don't pay attention to our bodies, if we don't pay attention to how we're feeling, then in time, the body catches up with you. One of the things that Eckhart Tolle was talking about with Russell Brand is one of the old Indian Sanskrit terms, which is called Sat-chit-ananda. There are various explanations as to how this is translated. So some people will refer to it as sat as being, and then chit as consciousness, and then the ananda as bliss. So it's being, conscious, bliss. And then it becomes more generalized in the terms of being referred to as the ultimate unchanging reality. And how to truly distill it is it's the sense of just simply being. So we all live in the world of simply doing. And the doing is piling the next thing on top of the next thing on top of the next thing. So when Eckhart Tolle talks about sitting on the park bench, he talks about simply being. As a practicing Buddhist, I have great issue with many parts of the lineage within how Buddhism is thought, because the Buddha's teaching, like the most important part of the Buddha's teaching, full stop, is that he says life is suffering and there's an end to suffering. And the difference between the suffering and the end to suffering is when you learn the idea of being. Because the suffering is the ego. It is the drive to always feed this ego. The more I feed my ego, the less I am able to be. Because in both in Hindu traditions and in Buddhism, we see the ego as almost a separate entity to ourselves. So as humans, we have this ego. And the anxiety that we feel, or the depression that we get brought into, so in the Buddhist teaching, is there is suffering and there's the end of suffering. And the end of suffering is when we just come to terms with the fact that we simply are able to be. So the Buddha sat under a Bodhi tree and watched the world go by and realized that people are sick, people are dying, people are happy, people are sad, people are hateful, people are loving. But when he noticed that all these things are happening, he started to notice the conscious truth, the ultimate unchanging reality. That if I can just see life as it is, just as it is, without making it complicated, then I can just start to accept it in many ways. Because the non-acceptance of life is where we create the anxiety, because we have this desire for things to be quite different. So, in many ways, if we say that the ultimate unchanging reality, Sat-chit-ananda, is the ultimate unchanging reality, or is the nature of being conscious, then the ego seeks to pull me away from that nature of being. And Deepak Chopra has a really nice saying around ego. And he says, ego is edging God out. Ego, edging God out. And when he says God, he doesn't mean a big man in the sky. He means the godlike presence of ourselves, our capacity to be our own human being, non-striving, not attached to ego, not worried about how the rest of the world sees us, but to be able to be principally here, distilled down to our essence, and to be able to connect to the whole joy of just being. So Sat-chit-ananda, in another translation, and there's so many, is also the knower of all experience. And who is the knower of all experience? Well, I am, because all experience happens to me. Now, I can either be the knower of those experiences because I'm present to them, or I can be in my autopilot mode in my brain, and stuff happens around me that I don't really pay attention to. So it's the whole idea of just being able to slow down. And there's a really nice meditation that I'll share. It's like a 15-minute meditation. It's by Deepak Chopra. I think it's called The Joy of Living by Deepak Chopra, and it's principally around Sat-chit-ananda. So he actually gives you a mantra within the meditation. It's one of the first meditations I ever listened to. I've probably listened to it, 200 times. And every time I listen to this 15-minute meditation, I hear something different. And for the first 8 minutes, all he will do is talk to you about this whole idea of the joy of living. So the joy of just being with yourself, for yourself, being in this moment, connected. And then he moves on to meditation where you're listening to a river flowing and some bird song. And when he says, as you know from my guidance, when the mind wanders, use the mantra Sat-chit-ananda. And then try and listen back to the river and be back with yourself. So within the Vedanta, within the Hindu traditions, they use a lot of these things like Sat-chit-ananda. They repeat them over and over again because they believe that the tone and the intonation of the language is also healing. But the meditation is really beautiful because what he says in those first 7 minutes, and when I started listening to that meditation, I was extremely anxious, extremely depressed, in a very, very dark and unhappy place. And over the years, the more I listen to it, the more I go, wow, I never heard that. That's just amazing. Like the stuff he says in there was like, wow, it's groundbreaking. But of course, when you're caught in your own head, you can't. So it's a nice little meditation to use and go back to later on as you go through your own progress and see how you feel.